familiar with beavers, what they are, what they do. Looking at beavers in the wild as well. Why is it so kind of controversial, and what do they really get up to when they're let to do their own thing? Then we're going to catch up on the Delamere story. So we've got our Delamere Beaver project, which has been running for 2.5 years now. I've got some guest speakers. So we've got Melanie and Lucia, who are going to talk to you a bit about some of their research on site. And then we're going to look at kind of our vision for the future and see what Cheshire could be with beavers involved. Okay, so starting with the story so far. Always like to start with a bit of a pop quiz. So we've in the UK we have the Eurasian beaver. There's just one other species of beaver, which is the American beaver, but they are a separate species. So they can't they can interbreed, but it doesn't produce viable offspring. The Eurasian beaver is the only one we've got here in the UK. A few things that are commonly asked questions. They're mainly nocturnal and they are semi-aquatic, so they're coming out on land. But tend to come out kind of late evening, 7:30 onwards, and then they're kind of active all the way through the night into the kind of early hours of the morning. They're herbivores. They only eat vegetation, leaves, any kind of plants. They don't eat fish. It's a common misconception. Anyone who has watched Narnia, Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, seen Mr. Beaver in his lodge eating fish. That really isn't the case. They only eat vegetation plants, so they're not going to go through our waters eating fish at all. They're Europe's largest rodent. They can weigh up to 35 kilo. To put that into kind of context for a lot of people, that's the sort of size of a Labrador, so quite a big animal. They have 1 litter of kits per year, 2 to 6 kits. So, and they live in family groups. You tend to have a male and female breeding pair, and then they will have kits from successive young each year. And those young will stay around for 2 to 4 years before they start to disperse and find their own territories. What's the story of beavers? So they've had a bit of a journey to the decline. Why do we need to bring them back? Why are they kind of missing? Well, there have been a few other species of beaver. There was originally a giant beaver, 2.5 meters long, 160 kilo, a really big animal. And they were around when we were around as Homo sapiens, but have met extinction a long time ago. We've got the North American beaver, as I mentioned, found right across North and South America, and some parts of kind of Norway and that sort of area in small populations where they've been reintroduced by accident, but are doing just as well because they have very much the same behavior, the same habitat requirements as our Eurasian beaver. Why have they kind of met that doom? Well, they're very valuable animals. If you think about us kind of moving through the landscape as Homo sapiens dispersed across the world, you're looking for things that are very useful. Beavers have really strong teeth. They're often, if you ever see them, they're bright orange. They've got high levels of iron that makes them really tough, so they can chew trees. But as jewelry, as you can see here is really important, but even as tools earlier on. For food, they're a really good source of food and relatively easy to catch, to trap, hunt, and they provide more things than just meat. You've got castoreum oil and all kinds of things like that. And even today, they are still eaten fairly widely across Europe and America. You can see here the picture of Indians breaking into a lodge. You know, it's an easy source of food. And on the right, beaver tails. I don't think this is an actual beaver tail. It's a piece of pastry that happens to, when cooked, look like a beaver tail, but very popular in other countries. Castoreum. There once was a time when we didn't pump oil out of the ground, and there were only 2 sources of oil. Beavers would have been the most easily accessible source of oil, and it has a lot of uses. It's used in medicines. It's got medicinal purposes. It isn't oil, so you've got all those kind of qualities that oils can be used. The other source would have been whales, and that whaling formed quite a large industry in the past, and still does today in some countries. And that is one way of getting oil. It's still used fairly readily as for medicinal purposes, but also it has a really strong scent. It's used by the beavers for scent marking. They create these scent mounds, and they add castoreum oil into it, and it kind of acts as that, you know, this is my land, this is my territory, this is my marker. If you ever get the chance to smell it, It smells like TCP or meadowsweet, but really strong smell. It's not a bad smell, so it does find its way into various whiskies and aftershaves and things like that. It's been remarked in the past as being quite a pleasant smell. And this is what it looks like, and it's really handy. Before we had kind of drinking vessels and ways of transporting oils, that it was really handy if it was produced in 2 sacks within the beaver's body, and then it could be carried around and transported and sold and traded. So a really easy thing to get hold of. And fur is probably what really drove the demise of beavers across Europe and America. At one point in our history, the top fashion was to have a top hat, and that would be made of a beaver pelt. And it founded a lot of America. The fur trade of hunting beavers was driven, drove them to extinction almost. Definitely in the UK, pushed that extinction, but it's their pelts that were really highly desired, and it was for things like top hats. So the fashion industry has got a huge question to answer for, really, on while the demise of beavers. And there's a few things, beavers pelts were quite valuable. So here we've got a few examples. This is one beaver pelt, could be worth £0.75 of coloured beads. Even trading for a brass kettle, £2 of sugar, a gallon of brandy. It was a tradable commodity. And whenever you get a tradable commodity, something that's worth a lot of value, obviously, if it's in the natural world, it will be exploited. Unfortunately for beavers, that's pushed them really far back. And this is how far back they've been pushed. So the black marks on this map were the remaining populations around 1920. So these are the surviving Eurasian beaver populations for Europe. Similar story in America and Canada, where they were pushed right back to tiny isolated populations. In most cases, for Europe, only 1,200 remained in these kind of black splodges. Up to about 2000, you can see the orange areas, that's where they had spread to. So the population has really bounced back. You can see a kind of blue splodge in there as well of the North American beaver. There are lots of reintroduction cases, and sometimes they look identical, although genetically they're not. So they were reintroducing the North American beaver in some cases, and they've done really well, and they've spread, and now they come into contact with the Eurasian beaver. But as I mentioned, they don't interbreed or anything like that, but they do occupy the same habitat niche. So far, we've not found any American beavers in the UK. And the story's kind of spreading. So you can see further into the right, the population's increasing. It's even bigger than this now. For Europe, there are only a few countries that don't have wild living beavers, one of them being Portugal and Italy. That's recently changed. They do now still have those, now have really small populations that have appeared of their own will. But the story is slightly different in the UK in that we're isolated, and for beavers to swim the English Channel is a real challenge. Populations estimated in 2020 of 1.5 million. Bit of a reintroduction timeline. So since 2000, Eurasian beavers have been released into outdoor fenced enclosures. The outdoor fencing for every country apart from the UK is completely crazy that we'd have to fence them in, but it is what we're doing here at the moment. But there are about 40 sites in England with enclosed, England and Scotland with enclosed beaver projects. The wild living English beaver population is likely to exceed 60 territories, increasing year on year. If these beavers can have 2 to 5 to 6 kits a year, that every year that population can more than double. It's just a case of finding the right territories and the right places for them to coexist. More than 400 individual beavers. It's only approximately 1% of what Natural England considers represent a fully established and favourable beaver population in the UK. That's quite important because they are now of a conservation concern. So they're only 1% of where they could be. And if that is at 60 territories, then there's a lot more beavers that can be out there. So 2015 to 2020, there was the river otter in Devon. Wild living beavers were identified in 2015. This was all over the news. These wild beavers turned up. They'd been there for quite a long time, but locals have kind of kept it quiet and just kind of lived alongside them. But then, it raised that real question. Do we want beavers in our environment? Do we want them here? Because at that time, they were not considered a native species. They've been extinct for such a long time, well over 400 years. It does raise a lot of questions. On the 6th of August, the government announced that the beavers on the River Otter would be allowed to remain. So this is the only sanctioned or legal wildly living population in England at present. 2021, multiple wild populations established from illegal reintroductions and escapees. They are up and down the country now. They're in a lot of waterways in small and growing populations. And that's kind of driven Natural England to make a decision, or driven the government to make a decision on what we do with beavers. So as of 1st of October 2022, they were declared a native species in the UK, and in doing so become a European protected species. They're a Schedule 9 protected species, so that means that themselves, their organs, their body parts, but also their habitats, their lodges and their dams are protected sites. So any work that is required in those areas does need consent, it does need licensing, it needs professionals involved, and that's because of the sensitivity of these animals. So being a Schedule 9 and a protected species also brings that 1% of land currently occupied into question, where really they're now, the government has a legal responsibility to enhance this species, to bring it back from the brink that it currently is. They're all over the news. I think if anyone is interested in beavers, you'll spot all kinds of things popping up. They're popping up on beaches, pubs, bits of Pembrokeshire, where they're nibbling the back of trees in the back of people's gardens, and releases such as what we have at Delamere are increasing. You start to see more fenced enclosures. And we are starting to see changes in our landscape. We're having to adapt to this species. If that means that railway engineers are building a beaver pass, it just means that beavers can start to coexist with us. And that's kind of a societal change as well. Reintroduced in London, there's one project, currently an urban enclosed project in London. There's a second one due any time now. It has its license through, so there'll be more beavers about. And it's good to have them in urban areas. It's good to have them everywhere. They can exist wherever they want to. Where are beavers in the UK? This is a map taken from Natural England. You can find this online. They are in several of our rivers: the Otter, Kent Stour, Tamar, Bristol Avon, Little Dart. Y, they're on the Exbrew, Dorset Stour, D, Cotswold Water Park, and lots of others if you're in the know. But on this map, the black dots are enclosed projects, so you can see us a little bit further up in the northwest. We're quite isolated. But since this map was produced, Trentham Gardens, really local, Derbyshire Wildlife Trust have also done a reintroduction. So, there's a lot more infill into that map that is happening. It's just a case of us keeping up with where beavers are. Kind of takes me on to part 2. So beavers in the wild, it's terrifying. But why? Why do people think that it's so terrifying? So I wanted to show you some of the kind of impacts that beavers can have, because if we want to see beavers as part of Cheshire, we need to kind of understand the impacts they can have, but also they can be negative and positive, and there are ways around all of these. They've been reintroducing beavers across Europe and America for over 60 years. Any issues that can happen, some of these already had it and they've dealt with it elsewhere. Yet beavers are kind of coexisting. So beavers in the wild, I was lucky enough to travel to Bavaria and look at how they have beavers in Germany and how they live alongside them and the issues they can cause, but also a lot of the benefits. This is a beaver created wetland. You can see there's kind of reduction in tree cover. This was more of a paddock grazed field where the beavers have blocked up an existing ditch, held back water, created a really nice diverse pond, supports a whole host of wildlife. The meadows all around it were just full of common lizard, sand snake, sand lizard. There's about 7 different types of frog and toad over there, so really diverse. And the knock-on effect is you get a lot more wildlife around the area. The kind of components of a beaver habitat, you'll tend to have a lodge. You'll also have multiple burrows, and you can see that how a lodge tends to start is it's a burrow. So the beavers will burrow in, really good at digging. And what tends to happen is the roof of that burrow will start to collapse. especially as they increase the water level. So what they'll start to do is put timber on top and start to create these lodges, and they'll hollow it out on the inside. And they'll have multiple chambers. They'll have a drying chamber, a sleeping chamber, and in some cases a food stash chamber. But it all kind of relies on these dams. And a lot of people think that if we release beavers, are they going to block up our rivers? Are they going to go to the River Weaver? Are they going to go to the Dane and just block it? No, that's not the case. What they're after is a depth of water around 80 centimeters that makes them feel safe. And also, they're quite a lazy animal, despite being very busy at all times. If they don't need to create a dam, then why would they? So if they're in a main river, if they're in a main lake, they're quite happy to just live there without doing the damming. It's when they run out of territory, that's the limiting factor. Once they run out of territory, they'll start to push each other into places that might be less suitable. So problems and solutions, this is a very arable area. There's quite a few problems in this picture. We've got a little hut on the edge, which is abandoned, but it's still quite relevant. It's getting flooded because the beavers have blocked a ditch. This drainage ditch also takes feed from quite a large area of farmland, but the pond's there. It's really nice. It does flood onto quite long, large flat fields, which are supposed to be grazed. They have hay crops, and it's just not suitable for that landowner. So this is where they can come into conflict with our kind of land management. Also, you can see up on the hillside, there's some woodland creation. This is under a grant. The landowners had to sign up to say that 95% of these trees will survive. What if the beavers start to take notice of those trees? Which again is valid, and it can impact the farm income, but there are other ways of kind of looking at it. They can fell trees. Here's a nice example of a poplar. It's been ring marked. Beavers have taken off all the living layer around the base. You might ask, well, why would they do this? They are felling the tree effectively, but also that tree takes off a lot of the nutrients that they might necessarily feed on of the smaller, scrubbier trees. So why not get it out the way? Also, if it falls and it lands in the pond, they'll eat the top of it, and that's the stuff that they want. They want the thinner branches and they want the bark. So they've taken what they can get for now, but inevitably that tree will die. Simple fix. You can put mesh around the bottom of trees. You can also use anti-game paints, which you've just got grit or rubber in them, and that beavers just don't like to nibble that. So you can just do very simple things to protect the trees and keep them there. They do take crops. If there's a high yielding crop, you've got some nice potatoes or radishes or carrots and that kind of thing. It's a good source of food for a beaver. But as you can see here, this is where a beaver is made good use of a crop. It's come out and grazed all. You can see the brown area. And what the farmer's done here, again in Germany, is just put a small electric fence for a small part of the year to just deter the beavers. Once they realise they can't get in there, it's fine. I've seen worse damage than this from puddles or deer or boar if you're in certain parts of the country. So putting that kind of as context of other wildlife. They can block ditches where you do not want ditches blocked. This is a big area of arable land, and the beavers have put a dam in and held the water back. What you would expect in an area like this is that getting water off the land is really important. But times are changing. We've just ended one area of drought. Last summer was even drier, and the farmer in this case had allowed the beavers to remain because he's irrigating the crops. He's raised the water level enough to water all of his crops, and what he might do is reduce the height of that dam and just kind of maintain it at a certain level. So it allows the beavers to be there and to provide some of the benefits they can provide, but also he gets his crop watered, which is, again, really valuable for him. Flood defences. This is the Danube Flood Defence Project, where they're kind of moving their flood defences back away from the river to give it a more natural floodplain and allow natural processes to take place. And you can see here a huge amount of gravel, and they've had to take into account beavers and the presence of beavers and what damage they can cause. They can dig into flood defences, and these can collapse, or when flood water gets into them, it can eat holes. And this is all, can be quite a big problem. This is a diagram that I saw when I was there, and basically you can either build a dam out of, or a floodplain dam out of gravel, so it kind of collapses in on itself if anything tries to dig, or you can use things like sheet piling or mesh piling just to keep beavers out. I asked the water company in Germany, you know, what do they think of beavers? Surely you just want to get rid of them. They're an absolute nightmare. They're costing millions of pounds. And they said, well, no, they actually provide a lot of benefits and a lot of reduced flooding elsewhere. It's more a case of we'd rather have them and have really good flood defences. It's just a change in mindset and a change in theory. They dig, they burrow. This is a path. This is actually in Devon, where the beavers have tried to create a new burrow. It's collapsed on the top, but you can see it's right next to a public footpath, so it can create a bit of conflict with people. If you imagine you're driving a vehicle, tractor, or a car or something like that, then this is definitely something you don't want to see. This is one on a farmer's field where the beavers have burrowed out and it's collapsed. But if you imagine you're taking your farm equipment up and down, harvesting this particular crop, then you don't want to fall into something like that. So it does create conflict. This is where changing land management and looking at environmental land management is really important. Do we start to leave strips next to our waterways which can buffer and keep our soils in place? Also allow space for beavers, and this is what they do in Germany. They have these 5 and 10 meter strips that farmers can get paid for, which provide habitat for a whole host of other wildlife, not just beavers, but also negates the risk for themselves, so they're not falling into these holes, kind of thing. Flooding can be a real issue. This is flooding over a track. You can see it's eating away at the track and is a real problem. But the solution is that the beavers are providing a lot of good in doing that. They're slowing the flow of that water. They're allowing natural process to take place. It's just been allowed maybe to go too far in this case, or not quite the right space. And what they did here is put what we call beaver deceiver, which is plastic pipes through the dam. It doesn't get rid of the whole beaver wetland. It allows the beavers to be there. It just limits how much they can flood. This did take the water off that track and allow the repair of the track. And it means that the beavers can improve this nice site and have it really good for wildlife. And you'll see some of that a little bit later on. This was that same track. So as it's kind of broken away, someone's tried to take a harvester through it and created that's a wheel rut that man is just sending in down the bottom. So quite a distance to fall down, and you don't want to be doing that. And simple things like this, creating these sort of beaver deceivers and pipe networks can just allow beavers to be there. Lots of benefits. And they are cute and fluffy at the same time, and they're a really good way of people to get people kind of interested in the environment. This is our beavers on the release day, and as you can see, they're great. They're fantastic to watch. If anyone's made it out on one of our beaver evenings, then absolutely fantastic to watch them. And they could be living wild right across the UK eventually. So the benefits, well, that's a lot of negatives. I don't want to fill you full of dread and that you think that they're not a good thing. These beaver-created wetlands support a whole host of other wildlife. We're currently in a nature and climate crisis. We're seeing a lot more drought. The knock-on effect of that in wildlife it's unrecorded at the moment. We're starting to see huge levels of invertebrates drop right across a lot of our nature reserves, even in Cheshire. And that is the result of last year's drought. If we get drought more regular, we're getting reduced water through our system, which affects all of our wildflowers and all of our tree planting, that we need to start looking at land a little bit differently, and how can we keep water on the land better. So as a nature booster, beavers are fantastic. They do fight floods. These wetlands hold a huge volume of water. I'm not sure if Melanie will mention it later on, but we're estimating around 900,000 litres of water is currently being held in our beaver wetland in Delamere. That does hold right through the year, and it only really drops after a long period of drought. But what often happens after a long period of drought is you get a huge amount of rain. And in the case of our beaver dam, it just topped up and reduced any flooding down in Hatchmere and the flooding of any gardens and that kind of thing. So it does work. They're a firefighter. Just having wet, lush places, they just don't burn. So you can have the surrounding area really, really dry, but actually they're acting as a kind of a green buffer of wetland that can act as a refuge for a lot of wildlife, but also be that kind of fire break in the landscape. Clean water, we'll get onto that a little bit later on. We'll talk a bit about clean water. Drought, just holding water on land allows it to recharge water tables, and it affects not just where the beavers are and that wetland, but the surrounding area, which is we're starting to find again at our Delamere site. That kind of nature booster. This is a white stork nest in a beaver wetland. Here, what they've done is they've blocked some drainage, which is flooded an area of woodland. You've got a huge amount of standing deadwood. Standing deadwood, recent study indicated that that's the rarest habitat in the UK. And here you can see there's an abundance of it. And again, abundance of it in our Delamere site. This is a valley. You can see it's not overly, there's not a huge amount of trees there. Beavers don't just eat trees, they eat a whole range of vegetation. Trees are just one of them, and it's one of the ones that it's often more striking to see, but actually they don't focus on trees that much. In this case, this is 27 beaver dams in a row. It's one family. The dams are spaced out about 20 meters apart. And the result is, at the end of that kind of complex, you've got this crystal clear water, where the water is filtered through this wetland. It supports a whole host of wildlife, a whole host of vegetation, and it's a really nice habitat, reducing flooding, clean water. And this is another one where bottom of the village, this village does suffer from flooding at times, and beavers set up home. This is just a single beaver dam, but it's about 1 kilometre long, so it's a really long dam. And it's held back a huge amount of water and created this lovely lake. People go fishing in there, they go swimming in there. It's a really interactive place for that village, but crucially, it's reducing flooding further downstream. Right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Delamere story now. So, I've managed Hatchmere Nature Reserve for the past 8 years while I've worked at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. It's a stunning nature reserve. If you've not been there, I definitely recommend a walk. It's the red sort of splodge on that map down the bottom left. It's right on the edge of Delamere Forest, and it is a site of special scientific interest, and it's a Ramsar site. It gets those designations from the rare plants and habitats found there, which are really interesting, but they are in decline. With it being a triple SI, Natural England kind of monitor and give it a score, and its condition is currently in an unfavourable condition for what it should be. And we have really helpful reports like this water diffuse water pollution plan. And what it highlights is exactly that, the water quality going into Hatchmere is really poor. You can see the white line on this map is some of the catchments, so some of the water ending up in Hatchmere comes from within that white line. It's actually much larger than that. So anything that goes on in that catchment accumulates in Hatchmere, which is quite a diverse land use. You know, we've got roads, which you've got gritters on, we've got forestry, we've got some fairly intensive farming, we've got equine practices, we have got turkey sheds and chicken sheds and just loads of different things going on, which is all part of land management. But the issue is that Hatchmere is the stop point for where anything that happens with water in that catchment builds up. So that all kind of builds up. You get high levels of nitrates, phosphates, lots of silts, and the sensitive vegetation that should be there and the sensitive habitats can't cope with that massive kind of influx. And the result is you start to lose those habitats and lose those species. And that's where the kind of Delamere Beaver project came across. We had looked at doing all kinds of different things where we work with a lot of landowners right across that catchment and right across Delamere Forest. We're continuing to work with more landowners, trying to get them into more nature-friendly practices or more soil-friendly practices. I'm trying to do quite a lot on Hatchmere itself. We trial everything we possibly can. We're using a lot of woody debris in the ditches and trying to renaturalize kind of ditches that have been altered over the past. And that can involve just putting woody debris in. So it's me with a chainsaw or a group of volunteers helping out. And once you've been in ditches with waders and chainsaws for long enough, you start to think there must be something else that can do a better job. And that's where the kind of beaver idea came from. Here you can see the female beaver on release day. She was about 12 months old at the time and weighed about 9 kilos. And the project aims, so we had 2 project aims. We wanted to increase biodiversity, improve water quality and chemical composition, and reduce sediment load at the reintroduction site. So what we want is a big filter. We want the beavers who are outside of the nature reserve on a slightly separate piece of land, but on one of the main inflows running into Hatchmere to create beaver wetlands. And whilst we're going to create this amazing wetland in the beaver pen, it's going to improve the water quality flowing downstream, heading into Hatchmere. We were about the 10th beaver project or enclosed beaver project at the time. There's now between 30 and 40 enclosed projects across England, Scotland, and Wales. And I think it was a bit of a guessing game. It's actually more of an easy or a streamlined process now. We were kind of in the dark about it at the time. There've been quite a few projects, but not as many aims as we were trying to kind of get away with. So it was a bit of an exploring process. And we were also working with local teams at Natural England who were really supportive and, helped us work through that process together. And we got our licenses. And what does a license really look like? It's quite a lot of information, but you need to look at how you're going to keep those beavers in, crucially. Fencing, what do you do if they escape, exit strategies, lots of contingency planning, and all the kind of things that go behind a project. And we got that license, which was fantastic, which meant that we needed fencing. And this was at a point in 2020, just after the first lockdown. The trust had kind of dropped off on some membership, the result of a lot of people being on furlough, kind of looking at their finances. We needed quite a lot of money to get this fencing in, and we were not sure what to do, but we did decide to go for kind of a door drop and an appeal, and we went to you, and you supported us all the way, and we managed to get our funding very quickly within a few weeks. I managed to get our fencing in. You can see here, we were on a bit of a tight schedule, trying to get fencing in before the rain hit. And it did hit just after we got it in. You can see Darren on the right, just after he'd fallen in, clearing some trees away from the fencing. Darren, if you go to any of our reserves and they've been well trimmed back, kind of thing, it's usually Darren who's in there doing it. And it has greened up since then. The fencing's a lot more subtle now. Fencing's anti-climb and anti-dig, just designed to keep the beavers in. There's also a lot of other structures that go with it. We need access, we need gates that are beaver proof, so we can get access to the site and also show people around. We need to look at kind of escape options. On the left is the inflow point, on the far right is the outflow point, and we need to make sure the beavers can't get out to those places. We've not dug mesh in for the majority of the fencing, just where the inflow and outflow points are. So you can see here where there's a big ditch dug in just to sink a bit of mesh in, just to make sure the beavers don't hit an obstacle and decide to dig around it. And we started with this. You can see small pond in the center, and then kind of the upper side of the site, there's a ditch that comes through, kind of sneaks through the site. Fairly standard ditch, usually 2 or 3 inches of water all year round, and just designed to get water off land as fast as possible. It doesn't really allow any time for natural processes or for vegetation to take hold. It's there purely to get water, and all that ends up in Hatchmere. You can see the 4.3 hectares, that's our enclosure on the side, and water flows through that site and ends up in Hatchmere. And what we wanted is kind of we want beavers' natural behaviour to create this wetland and to filter the habitat, filter the water before it ends up in Hatchmere. This is what the ditch looked like, very standard. I need to update that photo because it looks very different now. And then we released some beavers in November 2020. It was fantastic to see them go in, and they have done wonders and all the kinds of things that we wanted them to do since they've arrived. What did they do? Well, they started to tuck in. We've not supplementary fed them since they were released. So, they have felled some trees, mainly willow and oak, and also spruce as well. They seem to quite like spruce. Felled a few trees. I wouldn't say a huge amount of trees, but definitely a few, and usually smaller stuff. This is one of the larger examples on site. Usually the smaller stuff because it's things like willow and stuff like that, and they want to move it around the site. But they do graze on vegetation through the summer. They're out on the meadow area at the moment. You can see this is a chunk of hogweed. It's one of their favourites. They're always cutting it. You've got a classic sort of 45-degree angle where they're kind of cutting that, taking it away. And they created dams. This is one of the mature dams on site. It's about 45 meters long. We've got another one, which is less mature. It's only about a foot high compared to this, which is about a meter. But the foot high dam is probably over 200 meters at the moment. So it's quite a long dam. It just needs more time to mature. And it holds back a huge amount of water. And the result is areas like this, which were quite species poor. You've got really overstood willow. You can see very little ground flora. And a lot of these trees are actually dead because they're just fighting for light. This is the same space. You see the same tree. Beavers have increased the water level quite dramatically, flooding the area. This was the release pond. You can now see that it's kind of merged right across the site, made a much bigger area. Again, flooding is quite a good thing that beavers do. What this means is that water that used to run in that 3 inches of water through the ditch, right through the site, it now spreads out through a vast wetland, so natural processes can take place. This is kind of a model of what that looks like in terms of water coverage. You can see the small pond. It's now spread out into a much larger area. We can also look at beaver feeding signs. You can see the L where the lodge is. Sorry, just telling my dog off for a second. The beavers kind of focus on the wetland. What we found is when we released them, they'd walk around the fencing. They'd seem to almost be a bit worried that they were testing us and exactly what we're going to do. Once they'd settled down, they built a lodge and they built a dam. They kind of give up on that and they've stuck to the water. And this very much shows where they're feeding and what they're feeding on. So this is our site in December 2020, taken with our drone, and then January 2023. And what you can see is a huge amount of water coverage on site, and really diverse. It's got different depths. You've got the deepest area, which is the pond, the ditch that was 3 inches and now up towards a metre. And it's back flooded areas of wet meadow, which is, again, it's quite shallow in those areas. And they dig canals through that, and it allows a lot of different depth, which supports a whole different array of wildlife. So we found that frog spawn tends to appear in the really shallow areas where it warms up really quick. Frog spawn clumps have gone from the few dozen that we could find in the first year to over 100 this year. You can see felled trees. You can see some of the dams, and this is a really nice wetland, really well structured and fantastic for supporting lots of different wildlife. And there's a lot of partnership working involved. You're going to hear from John Moores and the University of Liverpool and the Centre for Alternative Technology today, but it brings in a lot of partners. And one of the key things that we want from this site is exactly what we're doing tonight. We want people to know about it. We want to talk about it. We want to show you the benefits that beavers can have. And we're not shy, and there are some negatives, but the benefits are really, really positive, especially when we're in a nature and climate crisis. Taking people up and showing them, we've run, I think we put out over 200 tickets this year, evening tickets to members, which were taken straight away, really quick. Nice to do more, but it's timing up there as well. We've never not seen the beavers, and it's a good opportunity to just see the habitat as well and see that really they're not as scary as you think. And this is a case where beavers are kind of left to do their own thing. We can manage them, and we can do lots of things with them to kind of reduce any of these impacts. So I'm going to pass you on to our guest speakers, except fortunately, Jane Fisher from the Centre for Alternative Technologies couldn't make it this evening, but has sent me some slides, which I can't get the notes up for. So I'm going to run through Jane's slides and give you kind of an update on her studies of the project and how things are looking there. And then I'm going to pass you over to Lucia and Melanie after that. Yeah, so as I mentioned, Jane Fisher, Tom Barker, and Stuart Champion. So I'll present this bit and then we'll pass you on. Someone else can talk. So we're looking at freshwater ecology in the beaver enclosure through 2021 and 22. 2023 data is yet to be collected. So this is just kind of an interim report of what is going on so far. So looking at macrophytes, so macrophytes are your everyday plants. They're your large plants, complex plants that you can kind of see vegetation-wise. And it's quite interesting that what we're actually looking at here is in 2021, we had dominantly emergent vegetation, some rooted floating, and then some free floating vegetation. What we've actually seen here is a net loss in species diversity, where the beavers flooding across the whole site has created kind of a disruption, which has meant that the kind of rooted floating vegetation and the free floating vegetation is no longer obvious. That might seem like a downfall, but this is 1 year on. This is, imagine you pouring or creating a pond in your garden. You will drown out that vegetation. What is going to change, or given time, we're going to see a lot more of that species start to recover. And also looking at where those species are found, they were found in a really small pond in a small area of wetland. That wetland now is a much more vaster area. And it'll be quite interesting as that change kind of becomes more obvious. Looking at zooplankton, there's no real clear change in zooplankton between 21 and 22. But the species found are those that found around aquatic plants, and they avoid predation by fish and things by basically hiding in those plants. No real changes as of yet. Again, probably to be expected, although you might think that we've lost some of the vegetation, that's not reflected in the zooplankton. What we have found is that actually zooplankton numbers have also remained stable. So although the water chemistry has changed slightly, zooplankton, I'm quite happy there. So phytoplankton, we're talking things like algae and that sort of thing. And you can see the difference is that actually overall algae or phytoplankton numbers have gone down. That's actually quite a good thing. You don't want a huge amount of algae in your water. That's suggesting that there's too much nutrient input. It shows that the wetland system is coping really, really well. What we are finding is there's a change in the kind of complexity of that phytoplankton. What we have done is we've flooded a vast area which had a huge amount of leaf litter and a huge amount of organic matter. That is now in kind of a flux. It's starting to break down within the water system, and over the next probably few years, that's going to have to go through a process. And this has been reflected in the phytoplankton, that you start to see those species that like those newly colonized, slightly richer areas, which hopefully will change given time. Stuart Champion carried out master's thesis on benthic vertebrates in the pond and the flowing water. What we found is that basically because we've increased the water area and the water surface area, those species have then increased as well, and they've increased their area quite significantly. And the taxon richness. So this is your freshwater invertebrates. There's quite a few rare and interesting things found in Hatchmere, which is great. And what we're finding is that compared to a control site in July, that actually the beaver pond is more species rich even now, going through that flux system. So the conclusion at this kind of interim time is that it's a freshwater habitat in flux, and species are adapting to increasing water levels and more organic matter in the water. That will change over time. Water levels are going to increase, but actually we'll probably have less organic matter. We've got this land has not been flooded for maybe hundreds of years, so that organic matter has got to break down, and also it'll cap itself, so you'll get new silt and new layers on top of it, and a lot of that vegetation and that organic matter will be trapped. What it also indicates is that this is early days. We're a year into this study, and although we can't really identify any trends, what we will see is change over time. So we've got that habitat in flux. Right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Lucia from Liverpool John Moores University. Right, Lucia, can you share your screen?
Hi, yes.
Right, Lucia, can you share?
I'm trying. I hope
it might just take a minute. We've got quite a big audience.
Yeah, it wants to. Yeah. Can you see the screen now?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Have you got that on display mode?
Yes. Can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So, hi everyone. My name is Lucia Galvez Bravo. I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, and our team has been working at Hatchmere since just before the beavers were introduced in autumn 2020. So this is our team here. If this works. Sorry, bear with me because my computer is very slow when I'm on Teams. So hopefully, yep, there's a team at LJMU, and we've been working there for almost since the project started, since just before the fence was put in. And as Kev was mentioning before, the beavers already have very dramatic effects. This is just an example of how this post was at the edge of the beaver pond originally, and now it's in the middle of a wetland. So obviously very dramatic changes. It is what we were expecting, and we're expecting that these dramatic changes also have very significant effects on the biodiversity in the area, the diversity of the animals that live in the water and in the area itself. So one of the things we're looking into is how this diversity changes. And to do that, we are using a technique called environmental DNA or eDNA. This basically means that we go to Hatchmere at different points within the site, at the beaver pond, upstream and downstream from the beaver pond, Hatchmere Lake, etc. And we collect a water sample. That water sample is filtered on site using just a syringe and a special filter that has a very, very small pore size. Any DNA from any creatures that live in the water or that just live in the vicinity is trapped by these small pore size in the filters. The filters are then taken to the lab, and in the lab we can extract the DNA and find out what is living in the water. And we're doing that seasonally, every 3 months roughly, ever since before the beaver introduction. So at the moment, we only have some preliminary results. We have only managed to process the first year's worth of results. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of a couple of them. So for fish, these are the fish that we have detected using this technique in Hatchmere Lake and all the sampling areas. And the king of the show is, especially in the beaver pond and the vicinity of the beaver pond, is the three-spined stickleback. It is the most abundant species, the one that is recurrent. And at the moment, in a similar situation to the results that Kev just mentioned, we haven't found any dramatic trends. There's a little bit of maybe a hint of a little bit of enhanced diversity increasing in the area. But for now, it is the stickleback that dominates these little streams and the pond. And we're not seeing any dramatic effects just yet. But there's no negative effects either. So that's good news in itself. We have also managed to look at the results for the birds. And for the birds, I'm only presenting the birds that we're finding using the eDNA in the beaver pond and its surrounding area. We have a longer list of birds for the lake and downstream from the beaver pond. But in general, we are able to detect quite a fair amount of birds. And the ones that we are most interested on are the waders, the birds that are linked to water and water bodies. Again, our results are almost conclusive. It's quite frustrating. We're waiting to hear from the lab with the 2022 and 2023 results. But at the moment, it looks like some of these water-dwelling birds are in fact becoming more common. We're detecting them more regularly in our samples than what we used to detect before the beavers were introduced. So there's a hint that some things are happening, but not quite there yet because of processing time. So in a nutshell, on this side of the project, we are finding this, the use of the eDNA or environmental DNA, a very useful tool to monitor these beaver effects. After 1 year, there's a little bit of indication that biodiversity might be increasing, but what will really show and what will really answer the question, how long do these effects by beavers take to appear, will be revealed when we manage to get the 2022 and 23 data. And also we're waiting impatiently for the results on the invertebrates, because we believe they will be very interesting as well. So some interesting results, but not quite spectacular yet. And we also have some results for another part of the project. And for that part of the project, I would like to introduce our new PhD student. His name is Richard Young, and I'm hoping he can put his microphone on. Richard, are you there?
Hello, yes.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so Richard's going to introduce the part of, he started with us in February, so he's going to talk about the side of the project that he is going to address during his PhD.
Thanks, Lucia. Can you bring up the next one? Oh yeah, so here we go. So yeah, essentially I started back in February. As you all know, so beavers, they build dams, they dig canals, they raise the water table, they slow water down, and then they create all of these wonderful new wetlands. As you've seen before, you've got the dam there, and this area is actually next to the stream that Kev showed earlier. So where they've flooded over the side of that stream and made a new wetland. So I'm going to be looking at this, but coming at it from a slightly different angle and looking at the biogeochemical cycles. Do you mind flipping on to the next one, Lucia? So essentially, the biogeochemical cycles, there's lots of different cycles. They're kind of the way that chemicals and elements cycle through an area. So they cycle through the oceans, rivers, soils, groundwater, the atmosphere. For example, here you've got the carbon cycle, but there's other ones like the hydrological cycle, phosphate and nitrates. And beaver can impact these cycles by sort of slowing down the water, flooding areas, and changing habitats. So essentially, the beaver flooding can change the respiratory conditions in soils from aerobic to anaerobic. Essentially, this means that while they may change carbon in the way that there'll be less carbon produced, they might increase methane. So that's a common thing that can happen in wetlands. This change might be mediated or affected by microbes that live in the soils. And then the different kinds of habitats that they create will have different associated emissions factors. So as they change an area, you could see it earlier with the overhead footage of how you could really see the different areas that change from forest to wetland. Is the meadow changing? And all these different areas will have different associated emissions. And then finally, they also slow the flow of water through an area. So as that water comes through, it's going to be allowing sediments to slow down, sink and settle in the ponds, in the wetlands. And then this slowing of water and sedimentation might trap things like carbon or nutrients that are running off the farmlands into the site. So, well, I've only just started, but what I'm hoping to do is look at all these different factors. We've got the next slide. Essentially, here we are. So this is looking at some flux data. So looking at how much methane and carbon dioxide is being emitted. So from a fully wet site, from some of the partly flooded forest areas. So we're seeing what's coming out of the ground in terms of the gases. Also going to be sampling soil, kind of looking at what's living in the soil, how that's changing, how that's affecting these cycles. Monitoring habitats, sort of seeing which habitats are changing and trying to match those with with the emissions factors, and some of those emissions factors we might need to model ourselves. And then finally looking at the sediment, so probably getting out onto the wetlands, onto the ponds, and looking at what's been accumulating, how quickly, and what's in the sediment. So yeah, that's watch this space. It's early days, but we're getting started on it.
Okay, I'm trying to stop sharing my screen. Oh gosh, sorry about that.
Thanks, Lucia.
Yep, thank you so much, and it's very exciting to be part of the project. Have I stopped sharing now? I'm not sure.
You have, yeah. I think a few people struggled to get that through. It might have been the speed of the connection, but don't apologize for that. But I got them, and they were great.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much, Lucia. And next, we're going to pass over to Melanie. Do you want to try and share your screen, Melanie? Hopefully, everyone can see that.
And you see my first slide now. Is that okay?
Yeah, thumbs up coming through. That's great.
Perfect. Okay. So hi everyone. My name is Melanie Baker. I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Liverpool. My project focuses on quantifying the ecological impacts and the long-term sustainability of the Cheshire Beaver project. Apologies if any of this already covers a lot that Kev said, but my project basically does try and research those main aims that the monitoring scheme has. So there might be a little bit of overlap, but hopefully it'll just help it all stick in your brain. So why beavers in Hatchmere? So this is a little map of Hatchmere that we have here, and it's a site of special scientific interest and a Ramsar site, which means it is a wetland of international importance because it's been given this status because of regionally and nationally rare flora, fauna and habitats. However, historically, the surrounding peatland within the SSSI has been drained, it's been burnt, and this has led to the water table being lowered, leading to changes in plant biodiversity. We have also seen an increase in high agricultural runoff, which has led to declines in both ecological and chemical status of the SSSI. And this has resulted in an increased occurrence of algal blooms. This little satellite image here, you can see of the mere in 2016, which is very green, much greener than it ever should be. And so the beavers were released into the enclosure on the inflow in this little orange area here to try and act as a natural process driven management to improve both the chemical and ecological status. So how will the beavers help? And as Kev said, there's kind of two targets of the beaver enclosure that I monitor. And this is for the beavers to try and improve and create new habitats, and to reduce the sediment loads and improve water quality entering the Hatchmere SSSI. And beavers can do this as their damming behaviour helps to raise and stabilise the water table, and this slows the flow of water through the site and increases the time it takes for the water to reach the mere. And by creating a wetter environment, beavers enable wetland species such as sphagnum mosses to thrive, and this creates more habitats and allows the formation of peat. And all the plants will also increase nutrient cycling and help to filter the water and improve its quality when it leaves the site. So as Kev showed before, this is the hydrology of the beaver enclosure has really changed massively since they've been reintroduced, as you can see in the before in this satellite image and the after in the drone survey that they did recently. And how has this, how have the beavers made these changes and made it such a wonderful wetland site? I'll just take you through a quick little animation. So this is the site kind of pre-beaver in 2020, and the water would move very quickly along this main agricultural drain into the site and then out of it, and taking all the heavy sediment that comes from the surrounding agricultural fields and straight into the mere. After the beavers were released, the first thing they did was they blocked the agricultural drain, and this increased the water level very quickly at this site, but it didn't really make too much of an effect across the site any further than that. But in 2021 to 2022, sorry, that's just covering that, they started to build their first main dam. And this increased the water level massively across the site. The brown line here is kind of a rough location of where that main dam was. And they really pushed the water further up the site into the enclosure. And yeah, other structures, such as they made these canals and sort of small routes through the areas that weren't as wet to make them wetter. In late last year to the start of this year, they've also started building subsequent further dams and have reinforced the original agricultural drain, and even they've gone to the point of making little channels off that original the dam on that side to push the water even further to re-wet some of the areas that were less dry. And then finally, because of all this, there's been slight changes to the outflows. So in really heavy rain events, the water does leave the site at different locations. So as you can see, the complexity of the site has really increased, and this will be increasing all those microhabitats across the enclosure and promoting a higher level of biodiversity. We have seen large changes in the vegetation across the site, although unfortunately it's not quite yet reflected in our quadrat surveys, but hopefully when we retake them again this year, we'll start to see some of those changes. And we've also seen some changes in the water quality, which I will show you on a couple slides later. But in terms of looking at these water level changes in a graph form, which I really love, these are two of the sites that have really had some massive changes. So we have the drain outflow, that's that original drain, and then we have the pond on the right. And the red line is when the beavers were reintroduced, and the dotted red line is when they've started building their main dam. So they really increased the water across the site. And this has seen increases of about 80 centimetres in the drain outflow and 40 centimetres in the pond. And as Kev said, the pond is now absolutely massive. So a 40 centimetre increase in water is an awful lot of water that these beavers are holding behind this dam. But for me, the really interesting part is this little dip that occurs here. Last year, the country experienced a period of drought, but this was the response in the beaver enclosure. So levels did drop. However, the water remained on site and well above previous levels. Within the SSSI, we did see some dips, but the situation would likely have been much more worse had the beavers not been here. So it's really interesting. Here we can see the beaver enclosure last year on the hottest day of the year, where there's plenty of water. The grass is still green, it still looks really healthy, whereas on the far side of the SSSI you had this really dry area with massive cracks on the ground. And this is the kind of stuff that I'm hoping to model using some data from some of Cheshire's other meres. However, that is not quite ready to be shared yet, but please do watch this space. And then finally, a little bit on the chemical water quality analysis that I've been doing. So I monitor the water quality from the inflow to the mere. And what we're seeing, importantly, is a slight dip in the suspended sediment that we're getting in the inflow and the outflow, which means that the water leaving the reintroduction site is hopefully been improving. Unfortunately, this is not statistically significant at the moment, but in the future, hopefully it will be. Now, suspended sediment is quite important because quite often bound to suspended sediment is phosphorus, and there are targets that the mere has to meet in terms of phosphorus levels within it, and this is at 50 micrograms per litre. And currently, the water that's flowing out at the outflow here is starting to overlap with that target that we're meeting. So with time, hopefully we'll start to see those improvements that we really do want to see. So thank you very much all for listening, and all the people that support me through my research. I've got my email address here on the bottom and also my Twitter. Please do feel free to email me or follow me for any of my research or photo updates. Thank you very much. Pass back to Kev.
Thanks, Mel. Right, let's share my screen again. That was great. Brilliant, thank you very much. So I appreciate we're running over time quite a bit, but last few bits to kind of just mop through as we kind of go, and then there's some questions towards the end. I noticed a few people putting them in the chat, and please continue to do so, and we'll run through them at the end. So kind of looking forward, you know, we're part of a very beautiful problem. This is a video taken last year. We've got our mum beaver with 2 kits. We're assuming they've had kits again this year. If they haven't, it means there's something probably wrong. They're not easy things to film. They're very independent. A small beaver on its own looks the same as an adult beaver, really. But you can see here that they play. But this is part of quite a really nice problem to have, in that we're one of almost 40 sites that have got enclosed beavers. They're breeding every year. We will have a maximum capacity here in Cheshire, and we do need to consider where those beavers are going to go. And we also need to think about genetics and who those beavers could potentially pair with, and all that kind of question. But it is a national issue. But what we want is our beavers to stay in Cheshire and to do all these great things that we've discussed with Lucia and with Melanie about, you know, what all the good things that beavers can do. They could do this right across Cheshire if they're allowed to do so. Oh, hold on. Cheshire, well, the Wildlife Trust, Cheshire Wildlife Trust, we've got our 30 by 30 campaign. We're in a nature and climate crisis, and what we are aiming to do is 30% of land in Cheshire to be back to wildlife by 2030. A lot of people say, is that achievable? That's a huge question. Is that even possible? That's not the point. That is a led by science percentage. If we want to reverse climate catastrophe, we want to reverse the decline in nature, 30% is what we need to get to. As a trust, we look at ways how we can do that effectively. How can we make 30% of land in Cheshire good for nature, supporting our environment and wildlife? Quick math, 234,300 hectares in Cheshire. 30% of that will be 70,000 hectares. We've only got 7 years left, so you're looking at 10,000 hectares a year, which we're not doing on our own, and right across the board, I think is a struggle. The only way to do that is to think outside the box. So we funded into a project at Exeter University where they modelled all of the UK, looking at 2 things. They looked at a beaver forage index. So this is all land that beavers could potentially forage on. So looking at suitable vegetation, things like woodland next to waterways or grazing meadow, that kind of thing. They also created a beaver dam capacity model, looking at the depth and the width of rivers, and where beavers could potentially dam can indicate, you know, where they would be present. And it's a very interesting model, and we have it for Cheshire, and we can tell you where you could potentially get a dam and also where potentially beavers are going to turn up. But crucially, what it indicates is that 5% of land in Cheshire could be impacted by beavers. That's a really big number when you're looking at that percentage of hectareage. But even if it's just 1%, that is a massive improvement and a massive step forward towards the nature climate crisis. And that 30%, you know, if beavers can even bring us that 1%, that's great news. And we can start to see this right across Cheshire, really. We can have all these benefits that we really want to see. Right. So that's where we're kind of getting to now. We've had our Delamere Beaver project. We've got it. It's fantastic. And now we're treating it slightly separately as the Cheshire Beaver project, which is 2 key aims. This is the next step. We want to see the benefits of wild-living beavers right across Cheshire. And the only way we can really do that is for human and beaver coexistence. So yes, we're going to continue to work on beaver projects right across Cheshire, support other people for reintroductions, whether they're enclosed or not, obviously all legal. The only way that beavers will ever be allowed to do all these amazing things that they can do is that we allow them to do that, and we have to learn to coexist with them. A great way to do that is through education, through things like this, and spreading the positive word. Yes, there are problems, but there are so many benefits. So we are working on the Cheshire Beaver project. We are looking at wild release projects, but we're also looking at, as a society, how we, people who live in Cheshire, people who work in Cheshire, can be ready for beavers. and understanding of them. Often when something new comes along, it's that fear that's going to be the biggest issue to get over. If beavers come naturally and spread from these wild populations, you know, they can get to Cheshire eventually, if given it 20, 30 years. But what we want to be is a county that are ready to welcome beavers here. Right, I'm going to answer some questions now. And I just wanted to say, we do have some beaver adoption packs. They're digital adoption packs. They include a Barmy About Beavers booklet and a certificate to print and photos of Rowan and Willow to download. If you take out one of these adoption packs for £3 a month, twice a year, you'll get an email update about beavers and the vital work that you're supporting. This is an ongoing project. It's grown from what it was at Hatchmere, and you can help us support us. There is a QR code just on the left, which you can scan with your phone, but everything is available on our website. And we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this webinar tonight, and everything will be on there. Right. I appreciate we've overrun. So I will go through any questions. Any questions, again, go through the chat and pop them in there. Some of the regular questions I think I've hit. Hopefully, if my take-home message could be that beavers don't eat fish, that'll be a really good one. Right, having a look through the questions. Is there a minimum area that a beaver can be housed in, and what are the habitat requirements that are ideal before reintroductions? So they're a really resourceful species. I've seen them. A lot of people think that they need trees. That's not necessarily the case. They definitely need vegetation, and they need a diverse array of vegetation. You know, there needs to be something there all year round. We found at Hatchmere that actually they're eating trees in the winter, and the summer they're grazing on meadows and aquatic vegetation. So you need a diverse range of vegetation. In terms of area, it can depend exactly on that vegetation. So people often ask, you know, how much river would a beaver need? But it depends on the quality of that river. If we've got really good quality rivers with, you know, really nice buffer zones around them with diverse vegetation, it's going to support large populations of beavers. If you're looking at captive, you know, you could say that our Hatchmere site isn't big enough. It's fine in that what we will have to do and what we is within our licensing, things like that, is once our beaver kits from last year get to 3, 4, 5 years old, providing the habitat's not starting to decline by overgrazing, we'll trap them and hopefully find them a new home elsewhere. So we are kind of fighting the clock on that. We want to find them somewhere to go, and we do have quite a few ideas of where that'll be. So there isn't a minimum, definitely not a maximum. But the limiting factor for beavers and beaver population size is other beavers, which kind of goes on to the next questions about predation. In the wild, predators would include us, humans. More modern predators, cars, they do move onto roads and they do move onto land quite readily. Dogs, definitely a factor, especially for smaller kits. Bears will dig them out of their lodges. Wolves, mountain lions, leopards, jaguars in some places, I mentioned wolves, lynx, that kind of thing, foxes, otters. Fox and otter is the more realistic predator in the UK, but they're only taking potentially the smaller kits. What a beaver does is it creates this vast wetland for safety. So once it creates that, they're not very vulnerable to predation. It's more when they start to disperse and they've not got the safety of their wetland, or they've not got their safe lodge to kind of escape to. So the limiting factor is actually other beavers, other territories. They're fiercely territorial, and as one disperses, it's got to go through multiple territories to find its own place in the world, and that's where conflict tends to come in, and that's the limiting factor on population size. Just scanning through questions now. Any types of health issues? Not really. There are rodents. Rodents are pretty tough animals, beavers in particular, and they live fully wild, they live a wild diet. They're very active, and what beavers want to be is active. They don't do well in kind of restricted captivity. If they were in, say, quarantine or something like that for too long of a time, they don't like that. They're an active animal. For health issues and things like that, they're living wild, they're healthy, and we do keep an eye on them, but you know, nothing really to report on health issues. How many beavers would need to be present in a given population for various types of impacts as described? Well, this is 2 beavers that have done all of this at Hatchmere. 2 beavers can do a lot, as you can see, in quite a short amount of time. They live in family groups, so you'll have 2 beavers, which will have, you know, kids every year, and the family all kind of help out. So if we wanted to look at a population across Cheshire, you've got to look at it as it'd be a phased approach. You know, we would start with suitable places where we can kind of monitor and allow them to kind of branch out from there. And a few questions about genetics and that kind of thing. It's something that always comes up because we have got quite we started with quite a limited population in the UK from what we know of. There are populations that have appeared from, we don't know the sourcing of those, but they have been genetically tested, including our beavers. We know that our beavers originated from Bavaria. We know that their genetics, Bavaria is actually a very good place to get your beavers from. So they were reintroduced into Bavaria about 60 years ago, and they were reintroduced by hunters for hunting. But when European protection laws came in, they were not allowed to hunt them, and they did really well as a result of that. But they sourced beavers from across Europe, so they got a mix from France, from the Netherlands, from Russia, and the result is they mixed a lot of isolated populations and ended up with a really good mix of genetics, which seems to have sourced our population in the UK. So we have really good genetics to start with. People have asked about getting up into the site. So the nearest access people can get to is the boardwalk at Hatchmere. We do put tickets out for evening events every year. We tend to run a couple a month. They go to members first. So if you're a member, you will get those tickets through. They're just limited on numbers. We've never not seen them, and we'll of course be doing more events next year. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that email, which tends to come out in the new financial year. And yeah, there is a lot of competition. I think anyone who got tickets, well done. And I'm sorry to anyone who didn't. And you know, we will keep running these and definitely try to get tickets if you can. Someone asked if foxes are getting in. That fencing, the foxes just jump it, no problem. We've not had any otters on site. We've had lots of other wildlife coming through, polecats, stoats, kingfishers now a resident on site. So you know, it's a nice site. Lots of ducklings this year, lots of waterfowl breeding as well. Very territorial animals. Someone's asked, yeah, very territorial between family groups, but within their family group, you know, they're really very placid. So a few questions about kind of the Cheshire Beaver project or Delamere Beaver project. We love what's happening in Delamere. It's doing exactly what we wanted it to do, and it's a big showcase for, you know, if we want to see human beaver coexistence in Cheshire, then having this site available to take people can show them, having it as a training centre as well. We are starting to run some training courses up there on beaver ecology and that kind of thing. You know, it's really valuable. The Cheshire Beaver project is slightly different. You know, we're going to have to bring together lots of landowners. We're talking with the Environment Agency and Natural England to get a lot of people on board. And looking at that, you know, it might not be, although we'd like to see a wild release, it might be just a case of us having a plan ready for when beavers do arrive and having, you know, the mitigation. They do cause issues, and we want to have a system in place that can deal with that in a wildlife and beaver friendly way. One on Lucia's project on eDNA, but I think I can probably answer it. Someone's asked, does eDNA give an indication of numbers of species, or is it just finding which species are present? Wondering if some species leave much more eDNA than others. I think, Lucia, do put in if I'm wrong, but I think it's more just an indication of presence rather than numbers, because you're going to pick up just the DNA that's present. We have used eDNA for years for great crested newt surveys and that kind of thing, so it's nice to see it start to roll out for other species. Lucia, you popped in. Hello.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the current consensus is that for certain species, such as fish, that if you do a calibration, knowing what species are around, then you can use it to estimate abundance. But in general, you're absolutely right. We tend to use it just as a measure of presence, absence for most species, and that we are taking that sort of conservative approach ourselves at the moment. We're a little bit too far away from using it because it's just too different. And obviously it depends whether the animal is actually living in the water, or it's more like a bird that uses the water but doesn't actually live inside it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just the last couple of questions then. Someone's asked about, we didn't bury the fence in. Have you not had any escape issues? No, the fencing is laid out on the ground. How someone described it to me is that if a fence exists and a beaver runs kind of, or any kind of mammal, or how a mammal's mind works, is that they will hit a barrier and then dig at that barrier. If they took a 50 centimeter step back, they could dig straight under the fence. It's never happened, and someone told me that will never happen, and I've stuck with it, and it's worked. Someone asked about lifespan, which Richard's replied to. Up to 28 years in captive, 12 to 14 years in. So someone's asked about a 5-year project. What is Hatchmate is a 5-year project. Will they be allowed to stay? We'll have to resubmit a license. There's no reason why they will not stay, and we are committed to keeping them there. And someone finally asked, last question, do you know the sex of the kits yet from last year? No, we don't. So what we will eventually do, or within our licensing, it says that we will trap and microchip the beavers. This happens to parents. At that point, they would be sexed. We've kind of made the decision to do that at the point we move them to another site. So we would have a look at the sex and gender, and then there's no point in us trapping them. It's very intrusive. It's not something we really want to be doing. So we're leaving them to it. They won't breed while they're with their kind of parents. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much. Thank you for listening this evening. I'm very sorry we've overrun by quite a bit of time. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope we've got through some of your questions. And thank you very much. So far, we've raised almost £70,000 through donations for the project, and I'm really appreciative of that. It's allowed us to, do this amazing thing and start to bring beavers back, and hopefully, in the coming years, we'll see a lot more beavers in Cheshire. So, thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice evening.